Hello and welcome! Welcome to another part of our model on structure and physiology of the skin. I am Dr. Vitaly Mikhalkov and I am super excited to have you join me. The topic of this lecture is permanent makeup and tattoo procedures in terms of the skin physiology, the fate of the pigment in the skin. After the lecture you will find a quiz on these topics. So grab a notepad and let's get started. Now on the screen you can see a schematic fragment of the skin, on which I will explain what happens with the pigment in the tissues after permanent makeup or tattoo procedure. On the screen you see a situation when we have just performed the tattooing procedure. The needles pierce the epidermis and dermis and leave ink particles in them. This is a situation when right after the session the client looks into the mirror and isn't satisfied with the saturation of tattoo or permanent makeup color. It might seem too bright. Here you should keep in mind that in the process of applying permanent makeup and tattoos, both the epidermis and the dermis are stained with ink. You should tell your customers not to worry, because when the healing process is completed, their permanent makeup will turn paler by about 50%. What happens during the healing process? On average, for young people it takes 28 to 30 days, and it is associated with the renewal of the epidermal layer. At an older age, this stage takes a greater number of days. The upper epidermal layer is renewed. Together with crusts with epidermal squamous cell, part of the pigment is also exfoliated. Only after a complete renewal of the epidermis do we see the pigment residue, which stay in the dermis. There can be completely different results. The pigment can be unevenly distributed over the entire area, portions with gaps and places where the color may be more intense. To change the visual appearance, there should be a permanent makeup correction procedure, where you add pigment to places with not enough ink and even out the color distribution. But this is not the end. The fate of the pigment in the tissue is quite interesting, so let's move on. After a little more time passes, 2 to 3 months after the procedure, you see the following picture. The epidermis has been completely cleansed. It has already undergone a regeneration cycle several times, and the pigment that was very accurately placed into the skin begins to slowly blur and redistribute. This is a normal physiological process. Remember, when we analyze the structure and physiology of the dermis, we know that it's a very active tissue. The processes of synthesis and decay of collagen fiber and hyaluronic acid are constantly going on, and the immune system is active. All this ultimately plays a role in determining how the pigment is distributed. Over time, due to the physiological processes of restructuring the dermis, any precise and fine elements of permanent makeup and tattoos will blur to a certain extent. Why does it happen? The pigment is foreign particles that have been placed into the dermis. Your body does not care that you've done permanent makeup or tattoo for the sake of beauty. It doesn't appreciate the result. The task of the immune cells of the dermis is to get rid of everything foreign that gets into it. So the introduced tattoo pigment is attacked by our immune system cells and tissue macrophages. They try to destroy and remove the pigment. Over time, the pigment gradually sinks into the deeper layer of the dermis. The tissue of the dermis is constantly renewed, rebuilt, and pigment is redistributed gradually. From a thin line we get a blurry line with time, and this happens regardless of what kind of artist you are, what pigments, needles or machines you use. This is the physiology of the skin. On thin, dry skin this will happen after a long period. The clarity of lines or the hair strokes will remain longer. On oily, loose skin, in which physiological processes are faster, hair strokes in permanent makeup will blur in a shorter amount of time. What happens next? Over time, this process intensifies. Now you can see the next stage, another 6 months have passed, and the pigment has been redistributed even more. It has become more blurry. 2 years after applying a tattoo or permanent makeup, the pigment loses its density, color, and becomes paler. There are several reasons for the decrease in saturation. First of all, this is the work of the immune system. The immune system continues to fight pigment as long as it exists in the skin, and the process is especially active in the first months. The second reason is the effect of ultraviolet radiation. It is necessary to protect the tattoo from the sun, otherwise it will quickly fade and lose the brightness of the colors. Ultraviolet rays very strongly affect the tattoo pigment located in the tissue, enhancing its destruction and removal from the skin. The third reason is that it plunges into the deeper layer of the dermis, gradually blurring, changing the color that we perceive. One research study showed that amount of tattoo pigment in the skin decreases by about 80% 10 years after a tattooing procedure. Often, permanent makeup and tattoo artists believe in a common myth that they embed an equal amount of the ink in a certain layer of the skin, and the pigment lies evenly in the same depth. There is no such occurrence. Now you see an image that shows the histological structure of the skin, how the pigment looks and how it is distributed in the skin. The tattoo pigment in the dermis is extremely chaotic and uneven. The pigment in the dermis forms clusters, conglomerates of ink of various size and amounts. The pigment collects around the vascular formations and skin appendages. If you look at any permanent makeup or tattoo with a magnification of 100 times, it will be horrifying, because there will be lumps and uneven accumulation of pigment at different depths. It looks extremely ugly and it could be compared with an oil painting. An oil painting upon close-up examination will look chaotically uneven, but looking at the painting from a certain distance, you see images. You see a real work of art. What happens to pigment after tattooing? Particles of ink getting into the dermis are severely attacked by macrophages. Up to 30% of the pigment disappears from the skin in the next few months after a tattooing procedure. All the small particles are removed and only the largest accumulations of ink remain. Where does the pigment go after tattooing? Part of the pigment enters the nearest lymph nodes. What happens next? Unfortunately, science has not answered this question yet. For an indefinitely long period, insoluble ink particles remain in the lymph nodes. If a person with tattoo inspects the nearest regional lymph nodes, they will find particles of pigment. You can now see an image of the lymph node of a person who has tattoos. And this photo was an unexpected find during a plastic surgery on a woman who had tattoos on her chest. A stained lymph node was found in the armpit. Such discoveries are not uncommon, and this is a fact that you should also know. While there is no evidence that this is harmful or causes some kind of disease or oncology, this is a separate topic for research that lies ahead of science and medicine. Pigments will be in the body and the lymph nodes for decades, and unfortunately it is not clear how they will manifest themselves. At the moment, there is no information about the danger, and applying and removing tattoo is considered safe. Our discussions today led us to a vast number of interesting and likewise important topics, like permanent makeup and tattoo procedures in terms of skin physiology, the fate of pigments in the skin. In the assignments for this lecture, you will find a quiz to consolidate your knowledge. See you in the next lecture. I've been Vitaly Mikrykov, and as always, thanks for listening.